Hello everyone. In this episode of the Title Answers podcast, we are going to have an episode that I am going to call Show Me the Money. If everyone in the late 90s saw the movie Jerry Maguire, you know that Cuba Gooding Jr. at one point starts to negotiate with his agent and he says, "Show me the money, Jerry." When it comes to a real estate transaction, it's very important that any party to the transaction understands where all the money, all the purchase price that is being paid by the buyer and all the costs that are being assigned to the seller is going. Because in any given transaction, you're going to have the title agent, the real estate broker, the mortgage broker's company, or whatever lender it is that they use. You're going to have the inspection companies that are involved, the appraisal company. You're also going to have the government, which is going to come in and they're going to charge their fees in the form of documentary stamp taxes based on the purchase price of the property. So in any given transaction, you're going to have all these costs involved, and where does all that money go? In today's episode, I want to cover some of the main providers, which are the title agent, the real estate agent, and the mortgage broker / lender in the transaction, and how are they paid in a real estate transaction. This is very important because when it comes to a real estate transaction, all three of these service providers are going to be paid typically at the end of the transaction. What happens when you have such a structure? You're incentivizing all these individuals to get the transaction done, which is what they're going to tell you, I only get paid at the end. What you also have to understand is that creates another factor, which is those individuals want to get paid. They've worked so hard. They're there. Imagine Usain Bolt at the finish line about to cross and somebody just comes and tackles him and says, "Nope, you didn't finish." That's what can happen in a real estate transaction. And those agents want to get to the finish line. They want to get that baton over the finish line and they want to get paid. So if you understand how all these individuals make their money in a real estate transaction, you can better understand how to manage everyone that is working for you and make sure that you get as much value for what you're paying in the real estate transaction. The first service provider I am going to cover is the title agent. As you know from previous episodes, the title agent in a transaction acts as an insurance agent. In a transaction, the parties will contract and they will agree that one party will pay for the title policy at closing. If you're in Miami-Dade County, typically it's paid for by the buyer. The buyer will pay for their title policy and select their title agent. The title agent at the end of the transaction will give them a title policy, insuring them against any claims that may have arisen prior to when they took title. So basically from the date they took title backwards to the beginning of time, and they will charge them a premium, which is a promulgated rate, which is set forward by the state of Florida. So for example, in a transaction that's approximately $500,000, you're going to have between the lender's policy and owner's policy, you're going to have a policy premium of about $2,600, $2,700. The title agent typically gets to keep around 70% of that premium amount, depending upon the split with the underwriter, but it typically works out to 70% of those $2,600, $2,700. Then, in addition to the title premium, the title agent will typically charge what is known as a settlement fee, which, pursuant to RESPA, encompasses all the services provided by the title agent from the beginning of the contract to the close. And typically those fees will range anywhere depending from $500 to $1,500 depending on the title agent. So for example, Title Answers, we charge $750 to provide that service. And that's how the title agents make money in a real estate transaction. The second service provider is the real estate agent. The real estate agent typically in a transaction will be compensated by the offer of compensation that is provided by the seller in the transaction. That's usually the compensation that we will see. What's the standard structure? Typically, you'll see an offer put out there by the seller of, I will offer 6% commission in this transaction, which is typically to be divided 3% to the seller's agent, seller's broker, and 3% to the buyer's broker. Now, there's other minor situations that can occur. For example, the buyer says, you know what, I'm going to pay my agent on the side. For purposes of this podcast, we're just going to cover the most frequent situation. The most common scenario that you will see is the seller offers a compensation structure and the seller's agent and buyer's agent will be paid a percentage. Now, why is this important? Typically, you're going to hear agents in a transaction say, you don't have to pay me anything until the end of the transaction, which is absolutely true. And listen, when it comes to these podcasts, I am not of the mentality that I think that agents are overcompensated. What I don't appreciate, for lack of a better phrase, is agents that don't dedicate themselves and make this a profession and they just show up on a transaction. Because you do have your agents out there. Believe it or not, a lot of people like to say, well, this was a $300,000 deal. My agent got 3%. He got $9,000 and he drew up a contract and he showed me 2 properties. That's a lot of money. What you're not factoring in there is that agent might have shown properties in that neighborhood to 10 other buyers. He's had 4 other listings. He knows the market very well. Thanks to his diligence and his career, you've been able to put yourself in a position to make that money. It's the same thing as an attorney, right? People say, well, Jonathan, you charge $350 an hour, but you're paying for all the experience and all the knowledge that I've accumulated over the years, which allows me to quickly and effectively deal with the situation. Now, going back to the real estate agent, when they're making their 3%, why is this important? Because you need to factor this in to the equation. For example, if you're a buyer, a lot of times buyer's agents will tell you, you don't have to pay me anything. The seller's the one that pays my commission. Well, you need to factor in when you're making your negotiations, the seller is factoring into his offering price what your real estate agent is making. So you need to understand the dynamics of how it's all working and make sure that your buyer's agent, if he's getting compensated by you, is doing everything in his power to make sure that he's putting this transaction together, because you are paying this agent and you are effectively paying their commission. So they need to be out there and they need to be a professional that understands the market, understands what's going on, and is working for you, because their incentive is to get this deal done for you. And if they're not out there working that neighborhood, working the market every day, and you're simply just paying a commission for the price to play in real estate, you may be leaving a lot of money on the table. Now I want to cover the real estate broker in the real estate transaction. Most buyers and sellers are never going to see the broker for the real estate agent they are working with. Now, the reason I want to cover the broker is, and this is a big topic of discussion in the industry, is we've started to see the proliferation of the broker transaction fee. Now, the broker transaction fee is really just a result, in my opinion, of what has occurred in the last 10 to 15 years in real estate. We have started to see over the last 10, 15 years where it used to be that a real estate agent, if they wanted to get a contract signed, they had to grab that contract, go to the seller's house, meet with them, get it signed, go back to their office, scan it, send it to everyone. An offer would be out in the air, or a contract would be out there for 24, 36 hours. Nowadays, it's all done online. We have software that quickly provides the forms, the contracts, and parties can have a contract put together in 30 minutes, I would say even less, and executed by everyone digitally. As a result of this, most agents have turned to their real estate brokers and said, you know what, I'm not going to give up 20% of my commission, for these services, because there's less that you have to provide. As a result, most brokers have started to give it up. Now they've started to see their revenues decline. One effect has been they've started to charge a transaction fee. Now, why do I bring this up? If you're a party to a transaction, if there's a transaction fee being charged, you want that explained at the outset. You want to make sure if it's in your listing agreement, or if there's a buyer's agreement that you have with your agent, make sure it's explained up front, because oftentimes that's a fee that's being charged by the broker, and it's really a fee being charged to the real estate agent. So if your real estate agent is passing it on to you, you want to make sure that this is disclosed at the outset, that you're aware of it, and quite frankly, what is the return, the quid pro quo, shall we say, for this transaction fee. Because a lot of times the parties, you can pass this on to your agent. And I know that there's a lot of agents out there that are going to look at me and say, how could you say this? But the reality is that's a fee being charged by the broker. And if you're a buyer or seller to the transaction, oftentimes it's not even disclosed and it's not even in the contract, but at the last second, the real estate agent remembers that their broker is going to charge them this fee and they throw it on the settlement statement. So if you're a party to the transaction, look into these additional fees that are being charged by the broker and ask yourself, was this negotiated at the outset? Because if it wasn't contracted for, chances are you don't have to pay it. The next service provider in the real estate transaction I am going to cover is the lender. Now, for purposes of this podcast, I am going to cover the compensation of the loan officer. Reason being, when it comes to originating a loan, once that loan is originated, there's the compensation that is paid to the loan officer. Also, the lender is going to charge certain fees to the borrower for originating that loan. These could be underwriting fees, which cover some of the processing of the files. There's also appraisal fees, credit report fees that go into it. And additionally, there may be points that are charged to the borrower depending upon whether or not the borrower bought down their rate or a rate lock had to be purchased, etc. on the loan. And additionally, typically the lender can also make money when they sell their loan on the secondary market, but that's a whole other animal. The most important thing I want to cover for purposes of this podcast is, how is the loan officer compensated? Now, without getting into all the complicated types of agreements that they can have, typically the way the loan officer is going to be compensated is a percentage of the loan amount. Now, if the loan officer works for a bank, such as a community bank, or large lenders such as Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, typically they are going to be on the lower end of the scale. What is the scale? From my understanding is, it is typically anywhere from 50 basis points to 300 basis points. Basis points are basically a percentage of the loan amount. So think of it as 0.5% to 3% of the loan amount is what the loan officer is going to make on the transaction. Now, if the loan officer, like I said, works at a lender, they typically get a lot more leads, they have a lot more volume, so they're typically on the lower end of the scale. A mortgage broker who works independently is going to have a lot more overhead that he takes on. He's going to have a lot more involved in his process. They charge typically a little, they get paid more by whoever the ultimate lender is on that loan. So keep that in mind, because when you're dealing on a transaction, that's going to affect. How does this affect the transaction? For example, if you're dealing with a large bank, since that loan officer is making a little bit less on the transaction because they have a lot more volume, if your file starts to have a lot more issues, it becomes difficult for them to dedicate a lot of time. Usually banks are used to dealing with individuals that have what is known as cookie cutter financials, easy financials for them to evaluate, right? Somebody who's salaried, somebody who fits the box, and the loan is easier to process. A mortgage broker, on the other hand, typically works with different lenders because they're used to working with borrowers that may have a lot more fluid financial situations, and what ends up happening, they make a little bit more. Now, keep this in mind when you're going through your real estate transaction, because if you're trying to achieve your objective and you're trying to achieve a loan, remember, this individual is making money by originating this loan, and you need to think, how do I use this, or how do I incorporate this into my strategy for negotiating my purchase price, making sure I get my loan, because you want to make sure you have the right individual working for you and helping you get that loan so you can buy the property that you want to buy at the end of the transaction.